The unexpected visitor. Mark had lived alone for many years in the quiet corners of the human colony, far from the bustling city. He was a simple farmer, waking up at dawn and working through the long days. There was no rush in his life. The days felt peaceful, even though the colony was surrounded by the unknown. The vast, dark space full of mysteries. Mark had gotten used to it, but it didn't mean he wasn't curious. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of red and orange, Mark sat by his small fire, cooking the simple meal. The wind blew gently, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. It was a peaceful evening, just like any other. Suddenly, the wind grew stronger. It felt different, colder, and Mark frowned. He stood up and glanced around. That was when he saw her, a figure in the distance, moving slowly toward him. At first, Mark thought it was some sort of animal, maybe a wild creature, but as she got closer, he could see it was a woman. An alien woman. She was tall, with long silver hair that shimmered like the stars. Her skin had a faint glow, and her eyes were the most unusual Mark had ever seen. They were a deep, glowing blue, almost like they held the secrets of the universe inside them. Mark's heart raced. He had seen aliens before, but none like this. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was she in trouble? Was she dangerous? The woman stumbled, falling to her knees. Her hand reached out toward Mark, as if she needed help. Without thinking, Mark rushed to her side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. She nodded slowly, but her breath came in shallow gasps. Mark noticed the strange markings on her arms, like burns or wounds. She was hurt. I need help," she whispered, her voice soft and almost musical. Mark didn't know why, but something about her made him want to help. Without a second thought, he lifted her up and carried her into his small home. He placed her gently on his bed and quickly went to get some water. The woman's breathing was shallow, and her body felt cold. She was trembling and her eyes were closed, but she was alive. Mark didn't know where she had come from or what she was. All he knew was that she needed help. He wet a cloth with water and gently wiped her forehead. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky but grateful. Mark smiled softly. "It's no problem. You're safe here." She looked around the small room, her gaze lingering on the simple furniture, then back to him. You aren't human." Mark nodded. "Yeah, I'm human. My name is Mark. What's your name?" The woman hesitated for a moment, as if she was trying to find the right words. "Alara," she said softly. "I am. Alara." Mark sat on the edge of the bed, still watching her closely. "Where did you come from, Alara? How did you get here?" Alara's eyes grew distant, as though she was lost in thought. "My ship, it crashed," she said quietly. "I was alone. I needed to find help, and I found you." Mark was surprised. He had heard stories of ships crashing on remote planets, but he never imagined he would be the one to find a survivor. He didn't ask about her past. She was here now, and that was all that mattered. "You're safe now," Mark said, trying to reassure her. Alara looked at him for a long moment, her glowing blue eyes never leaving his face. There was something almost magnetic about her gaze, something that made Mark feel uneasy, and yet drawn to her at the same time. He couldn't explain it. Her beauty was like nothing he had ever seen, and there was an energy around her that he couldn't quite understand. "I'll fix your ship," Mark said, trying to change the subject. "I'll see if I can help you get back home." But Alara shook her head slowly. "My ship is beyond repair," she said softly. "I will stay here, with you." Mark was taken aback. "Stay here," he repeated. "But I don't have much. I'm just a farmer." Alara smiled weakly, but there was something about her smile that made Mark feel uneasy. "I don't need much," she replied. "I just need a place to rest. a place where I am safe. Mark thought about it for a moment. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't just leave her out there. Besides, he didn't mind the company. He'd been alone for so long. It felt strange, but also comforting. "All right," he said, his voice unsure but kind. "You can stay here for as long as you need." Alara's eyes glimmered with something Mark couldn't place. She didn't thank him, but her look said everything. She was grateful, but there was something else in her gaze, a hunger, a need. Mark didn't notice it at first, but as the night wore on, and he sat across from her, something began to feel off. Alara was quiet, watching him from the corner of her eye. Mark had no idea what he had just done. He had invited an alien woman into his life, and he had no idea how dangerous this decision could become. Mysterious origins. The night passed quietly, but Mark could not shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He awoke early the next morning to find Alara sitting by the window, staring out into the vast, empty wilderness beyond his small farm. The soft morning light illuminated her delicate features, and for a moment, Mark thought she looked almost ethereal. She had said little since the night before, only offering a quiet thank you, and then retreating into a silence that felt more like a quiet storm. There was something in her eyes, something that made Mark feel both drawn to her and wary of her at the same time. He tried to shake off the unease. After all, she was just a person. An alien, yes, but she needed help. He couldn't ignore that. "Good morning," Mark greeted her, walking over to where she sat. Her eyes flicked toward him, and her lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she responded softly, her voice almost musical, like a melody Mark couldn't quite place. Mark leaned against the wooden table, trying to keep the conversation light. "I was thinking about looking for your ship wreckage today. See if there's anything I can salvage. Maybe I can help you get back home." Alara turned her gaze from the window to him, her expression unreadable. She nodded slowly, but there was an odd glint in her eyes, as if his words didn't matter to her as much as he thought they should. "You do not need to search for my ship," Alara said, her voice low, almost too calm. "It is lost, beyond saving." Mark frowned. "But you said you crashed. You must have been in a ship, right?" Alara turned her face toward him fully now, her glowing blue eyes locking onto his. There was something almost hypnotic about them, and for a moment, Mark found himself unable to look away. "Yes, I was in a ship," she said, "but it is no longer important." "Why is it no longer important?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued despite his growing sense of caution. Alara remained silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. Then, in a soft whisper that sent chills down his spine, she said, "I am not here for your ship, Mark. I am here for something else. For you." Mark blinked, confused. "For me?" Alara's lips parted slightly as she leaned a bit closer to him. There was an intense, almost predatory focus in her gaze, and Mark felt a strange heat rise in his chest. It wasn't like anything he had ever felt before. The air between them seemed to crackle with an energy he couldn't explain. "Yes," she whispered, her voice almost a caress. "For you." Mark recoiled slightly, unsure of what to make of her words. "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand," she replied, standing up and moving closer. "You will." Alara's movements were fluid, graceful, and unsettlingly deliberate. Her gaze never left his face, and Mark felt an odd tension building in his chest. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a simple alien stranded on his planet. There was something more to her, something Mark couldn't quite grasp. Alara stopped just inches away from him, her presence overwhelming. "I told you, I am here for you. You are the reason I survived. My instincts, my kind's instincts, they have guided me here." Mark's mind raced. What did she mean? Instincts. The way she looked at him made him feel uneasy. He stepped back, trying to clear his thoughts. "You're hurt," Mark said, his voice faltering a bit. "You need rest." Elara smiled, but it wasn't the soft, grateful smile from the night before. It was different, smoldering, almost predatory. "I am healing, Mark. But more than that, I am beginning to feel something else." Mark's pulse quickened. There was something about her that was drawing him in, something he couldn't understand. But he knew it wasn't good. Her presence, her beauty. It felt like a trap he couldn't escape. "Something else?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Elara stepped closer again, her breath warm against his skin. "Yes, it's a feeling that has been growing ever since I laid eyes on you. You may not realize it, but your touch, your kindness, it has awakened something deep within me." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what she was saying, but he didn't want to believe it. She couldn't possibly be suggesting that she was attracted to him. "Listen," he said, trying to keep calm. "You're not from here. I've helped you because I thought you needed it, but I don't know what you're talking about. I think it's best if you just rest, all right? I'll go out and see if I can find something to help you." Elara's gaze softened, but there was still a hint of something dark behind her eyes. "You don't need to look for anything, Mark. Everything you need is right here." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with a meaning Mark wasn't ready to face. He stepped back again, his heart racing. What had he gotten himself into? Elara smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that made Mark's skin prickle. She wasn't just a survivor of a crash. She wasn't just an alien in need of help. There was something more to her, something ancient and dangerous. Mark knew he had to get away from her for a while, to think. He had invited her in, but now, the feeling of dread was building, pressing in from all sides. What if he had made a terrible mistake? As Mark turned to leave the room, Elara's voice called after him, soft and haunting. "You can't escape what's coming, Mark. You and I are connected now. You'll see." Mark's hand trembled as he reached for the door. He didn't know if she was trying to manipulate him or if she truly believed what she was saying. But as he stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous had just begun. The first signs. The next few days passed in a strange, uncomfortable silence. Mark went about his usual routine, checking his crops, mending tools, and doing what he could to make his home as comfortable as possible. But every moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elara was always watching him, even when he wasn't looking. It was as if she were waiting for something. At first, it seemed innocent enough. She would sit by the window, staring out into the vast expanse of the colony's horizon, her glowing blue eyes softening with the light of the setting sun. She didn't speak much, but there was an air of calmness about her that Mark tried to convince himself was nothing more than gratitude. Yet, as each day passed, Mark began to notice the odd little details. The way she lingered just a bit too long when they were in the same room. The way her gaze seemed to track his every movement, no matter where he went. He'd turn a corner and find her already standing there, as if she had known he'd be coming. It was unsettling. One afternoon, as Mark worked on repairing a section of the fence, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting it to be one of the local farmers stopping by, but it was Elara. She was standing just beyond the fence, watching him. There was a faint smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice low and almost too sweet. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow and tried to ignore the creeping unease that swept over him. "I've got it covered," he said, offering a polite smile. "Thanks, though." Elara didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on him, as if she were trying to read his every thought. Mark couldn't shake the sensation that she was waiting for him to say something more, but he didn't know what that was. "You look tired," Elara said, finally breaking the silence. "Maybe you should rest. I could finish this for you." Mark's hand stopped moving, and he felt a cold shiver run up his spine. There was a strange weight in her words. The tone was so calm, yet there was something dark hidden beneath it. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, turning back to the fence. But before he could continue working, he felt her presence behind him, so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her body. "Mark," she whispered, almost like a breath. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't dare look back. There was something in the way she said his name that sent a jolt of panic through him. He could feel her eyes on the back of his neck, and the hairs on his arms stood up. "Alara, please," Mark began, his voice shaky. "I need to finish this. Can you?" He stopped mid-sentence when he heard a strange noise. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft, low purring sound. Mark turned abruptly, his eyes locking onto Alara. She was staring at him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. The corner of her mouth lifted into the faintest of smiles. The low, purring sound came from her again, this time more pronounced. It wasn't a human sound. "Alara?" Mark asked, his voice unsure. "What are you doing?" Alara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her eyes never left his face, and there was a strange, hypnotic quality in the way she moved. She didn't seem to be walking. She seemed to glide across the ground. "I'm just enjoying your company," she said softly, her voice like velvet, smooth and warm. Mark backed away, his heart racing. He knew there was something wrong, but he couldn't explain it. This wasn't just a woman. This wasn't just an alien stranded on his planet. There was something else, something more dangerous lurking beneath her calm exterior. "Look, I'm tired," Mark said, his voice firm. "I think you should rest for the day." Alara didn't respond at first. She only smiled, that same strange smile, before she turned and walked back toward the shelter. Mark watched her leave, feeling a mixture of confusion and fear. He didn't understand what was happening. Alara had been kind, but now she was becoming something else. He had noticed the way she had looked at him, the way she lingered near him, the way she never seemed to need sleep or food. It was almost as if she didn't need anything at all except him. The following morning, Mark woke early, still troubled by the strange encounter. As he prepared his breakfast, he heard soft footsteps behind him again. He turned, expecting Alara, but it was her again, standing in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes seemed darker now, almost filled with an intensity that was hard to ignore. "Good morning, Mark," she said, her voice soft, but there was something in it that made his pulse quicken. "Did you sleep well?" Mark blinked, suddenly aware of how close she was to him. He quickly stepped back, his hand instinctively brushing the knife he had been using to cut bread. I'm fine," he said, his voice catching. "I thought you were resting." Alara smiled again, that same knowing smile, and for a brief moment, Mark could see something almost predatory in her eyes. "I've rested enough," she said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "Now, I think I need your attention, Mark. All of it." Mark froze. He had been trying to avoid it, but now he couldn't deny it anymore. There was something deeply wrong with Alara. She wasn't just a stranded alien. She was something else entirely. And no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from her, it was clear now, she wasn't going anywhere. The unseen danger. The days were growing colder, and Mark had noticed the subtle changes in Alara. At first he thought it was just his imagination, a product of his growing paranoia. But now he wasn't so sure. Every time he turned around, Alara seemed to be just a little bit closer, her presence more pressing, more overwhelming. He couldn't quite explain it, but it felt as though she was marking her territory, his territory, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. One evening, as Mark worked in his small barn, fixing a broken tool, he heard a faint sound behind him. He turned, but it wasn't Alara. At first, he thought he had imagined it, but then he heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the door. But the door was already open. Confused, Mark stepped outside, but saw no one. The moonlight bathed the land in an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the fields. There were no signs of anyone being nearby, and yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He didn't go back inside right away. Something felt off, something was changing, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Mark decided to take a walk around the outskirts of his farm to clear his mind. The air was crisp, and the stars were brighter than usual. He was alone in the stillness of the night, his footsteps crunching on the dirt road as he walked. But the further he ventured, the more he felt the pull of something, a presence that wasn't just his imagination. As he rounded a corner, he froze. Alara was standing there, in the middle of the field, her back to him. The wind tugged at her long silver hair, and she didn't even flinch. It was as if she were in some kind of trance. Her posture was unnaturally still, and her arms were stretched out to either side of her, as if she were reaching for something in the distance. Mark called her name, his voice breaking the silence of the night. Alara? She didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. Something was terribly wrong. Mark's heart began to race as he moved closer to her, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but before his hand could make contact, Alara turned to face him so quickly that it made him stumble back in surprise. Her eyes were wide, glowing fiercely with an intensity he had never seen before. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight, and her mouth was slightly open, as if she was panting. "You shouldn't have come here, Mark," Alara said, her voice strangely hollow, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Alara, what's going on? You're scaring me." Alara's smile was cold and calculating, her lips curling into a sinister expression. "You don't understand yet. You will, soon enough." She took a step closer to him, and Mark instinctively took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to run, to get away from her, but his legs felt frozen in place. Alara was too close now, too powerful. "Alara," Mark pleaded, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" Her smile deepened. "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice dripping with honeyed venom. "I want you, Mark. I've always wanted you." Mark's mind spun, his thoughts racing. He had tried to tell himself that Alara was just an alien in need of help, that he had done the right thing by offering her shelter. But now, with her eyes fixed on him like a predator stalking its prey, he realized he had been wrong. He had invited something dangerous into his life, and now there was no way to escape. "You've been marking me," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words felt like they cut through the air. "I've seen it. The little things you do. The way you watch me." Alara tilted her head, almost as if she were amused by his realization. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been marking you. I've been waiting for the right moment." Mark's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, the right moment?" "The right moment to claim what's mine," she answered, her voice now low and dangerous. "I told you, Mark, I'm not here just to survive. I'm here for you. And once I claim you, you'll understand what it means to truly be mine." Before Mark could respond, Alara reached out and grabbed him by the wrist, her grip so strong that it felt like it could crush him. He struggled to pull away, but her hold was unyielding. "Let go of me," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. But Alara didn't budge. "I won't let you go," she whispered, her face now inches from his. "Not ever." Mark's thoughts were in chaos. What had he gotten himself into? How had things gone so wrong? He had offered her kindness, and in return, she had turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. But just as Mark was about to break free, Alara's eyes softened. The intensity in her expression faltered for a moment, and Mark saw a flicker of something almost human, in her gaze. She hesitated, her fingers loosening from his wrist. I don't want to hurt you, Mark," she said quietly, her voice returning to a softer, almost regretful tone. Mark, still trembling, stepped back. His mind was racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was this another manipulation? Or was it the truth? But before he could gather his thoughts, Alara turned away, her voice cold once more. "I've made my decision. And so have you, Mark. You can't undo what's been done." With that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Mark standing alone in the field, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to think or what to do next. But one thing was certain. Things were no longer simple. Alara wasn't just a stranded alien. She was something far more dangerous. Unraveling secrets. Mark didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The images of Alara's strange, almost haunting behavior kept flashing in his mind. The way she had looked at him, the power in her grip, the chilling certainty in her words. He kept replaying it all, trying to make sense of it. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. This wasn't just a simple case of helping a stranded alien. There was something far deeper at play, something ancient and terrifying that he didn't understand. The next morning, Mark woke to find the house eerily quiet. Alara wasn't in her usual spot by the window. He called her name, but there was no answer. Fearing the worst, he searched the house, his heart pounding in his chest. His steps echoed through the empty rooms, but there was no sign of her. His mind raced, wondering if she had left, or worse, if something had happened to her. But why hadn't she said anything? Just as he was about to head outside, he noticed something strange. On the table in the small kitchen was a weathered old book. Mark frowned. He hadn't seen it there before. It looked like it had been left deliberately. He picked it up, brushing the dust off the cover. The title was written in an unfamiliar language, one he didn't recognize. The pages were yellowed with age, and the leather binding was cracked, as though it had been passed down through generations. He flipped through the pages, scanning the cryptic symbols that seemed to swirl and shift before his eyes. But as he reached the last few pages, something caught his attention. There, scribbled in the margin, was a single word in his own language: Mark. Mark's pulse quickened as he scanned the note. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, as if the writer had been desperate to get the message across. The note read, "She will come for you, Mark. She will not stop. Her kind claims what they want, no matter the cost. The instinct is stronger than her humanity. Trust no one." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His hand shook as he closed the book, his mind racing. What did this mean? Had Alara left this for him? Was someone else trying to warn him? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp noise from outside. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the door. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of danger. Then, a faint whisper brushed against his ear, soft but clear. "Mark." He froze. The voice was familiar. It was Alara's. Mark spun around. She wasn't there. His breath quickened. Was he hearing things? Or was this just another of Alara's strange games? He stepped outside cautiously, his senses on high alert. The wind carried a chill, and the vast expanse of the field stretched out before him in eerie silence. And then he saw her. Alara was standing at the edge of the field, her back to him, her silver hair shimmering under the pale sunlight. This time, she wasn't moving like before. She was still rigid, as though waiting for something. "Alara," Mark called, his voice hoarse. "What's going on?" Alara didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned to face him, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were darker now, almost black. The glowing blue that had once mesmerized him was gone, replaced by an unnatural, empty void. She stared at him as if she could see through him, her expression unreadable. "You've read it," she said, her voice low and distant. There was something different about her tone, colder, as though she wasn't the same person he had offered shelter to. Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "What is this? What do you want from me?" Alara's lips twisted into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of warmth. It was cold, knowing, and completely devoid of any empathy. I told you, Mark. My kind does not let go. You are mine now. There's no turning back. Mark felt his chest tighten. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape this alien who had trapped him in a situation far beyond anything he could handle. But his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as though she had somehow paralyzed him. You've learned too much, Mark. Elara continued, her voice growing softer, almost hypnotic. And now you will see what it means to be mine. To be marked. Mark struggled to breathe, his mind racing. What did she mean by marked? Was this some kind of ritual? Was it possible that he had been part of something that he couldn't undo? Before he could process another thought, Alara's hand shot out, grabbing him by the wrist. The suddenness of it sent a shock of panic through his body, but before he could react, she pulled him forward with a surprising strength. You'll understand soon enough, she whispered as she held him in place. I am the one who decides. You don't have a choice anymore, Mark. This is fate. The air around them grew thick, suffocating, and Mark realized he was no longer standing in the field. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, unknown. The ground beneath him was cold and hard, and he could feel the pressure closing in around him. Alara's eyes were filled with something ancient, something powerful, as she whispered words he couldn't understand. But the tone of them, it wasn't a prayer or a chant. It was a command, a promise. And Mark realized, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that he was no longer in control of what was happening. Whatever had been unleashed, it had already begun. The moment of truth. The darkness around Mark seemed to close in on him. The field, once familiar, had vanished. The cold ground beneath him felt like stone, unyielding, as if it were a part of some otherworldly domain. His breath was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. Where was he? What had just happened? The last thing he remembered was Alara's grip on his wrist, her icy touch dragging him into this place where the air felt thick, heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. Alara, Mark called, his voice trembling. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, as though the world around him was shifting in ways he couldn't comprehend. There was no answer, only the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the silence. Suddenly, he heard it, the soft, familiar whisper of her voice. Mark. The sound of her name sent a shiver through him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Just darkness, stretching out in every direction. Where are you? Mark shouted, his fear rising with every passing second. He felt a creeping sense of panic, like a predator was stalking him. But he couldn't see it. The silence stretched on, making his head spin. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Alara appeared before him, her figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost. Her silver hair floated around her as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist, her eyes now blacker than ever. The strange blue glow was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to devour everything around her. Mark. Alara repeated, her voice soft but laced with a deadly edge. It's time to stop running. Mark's stomach turned. What have you done? Where am I? What is this place? Alara didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as if savoring the fear in his eyes. This is the place between worlds, Mark. A place where nothing and everything exists at the same time. It is where you and I are bound together now. Forever. Mark felt the ground beneath him tremble, as if the very air was alive with an ancient, terrifying power. His heart raced, but he stood his ground, trying to keep his voice steady. No, he said, shaking his head. I never agreed to any of this. You tricked me. Alara smiled, but it was the smile of a predator, cold and cruel. I never tricked you. You always knew what you were getting into. You just didn't want to see it. You thought you could save me, but it's too late for that. Mark recoiled, stepping back, but Alara followed, her eyes never leaving his. He could feel the air growing warmer, charged with an unnatural energy. You said you were just here for shelter, Mark said, his voice breaking as the reality of the situation sank in. That was a lie. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? Alara's smile widened, but her gaze turned sharp, almost predatory. It's not a lie. It's the truth. I've been waiting for someone like you, someone with the strength to help me, and to give me what I need. Mark's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean, give me what I need? Her expression softened for a moment, almost like a lover's gaze, but there was a deep, dark hunger beneath it. What I need, Mark, is your submission, your will, your soul. You see, we are not so different, you and I, your kind, your humanity. It is exactly what I need to complete what was started long before we ever met. Mark shook his head, trying to back away, but the darkness seemed to close in around him. He was trapped. He could feel the pull, the pressure of Alara's presence pushing him to the edge of something terrifying, something he could barely understand. I won't let you do this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. His chest was tight with fear, but also something else. Anger, defiance. I won't be your prisoner. You can't force me. Alara's lips curled into a sinister smile. I don't have to force you, Mark. You already gave yourself to me. The moment you brought me in, the moment you offered me your shelter, it was already done. Mark's mind was racing. He wanted to fight. He wanted to break free from whatever this was, but her power was undeniable. He could feel it, like an invisible force that pulled at him from all directions. You're wrong, Mark said, his voice gaining strength. I didn't do any of that. I helped you because I thought you needed it. But this, whatever this is, it ends now. Alara's expression darkened. You think you have a choice. You think you can stop this. She moved towards him in a flash, faster than he could react. Mark stumbled backward, but Alara's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with an iron grip. He tried to pull away, but her fingers dug into his skin, locking him in place. You still don't understand, do you? Alara hissed. You are already mine. You always were. You're part of something much bigger than yourself now. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The cold dread that had been creeping inside him was now a full-on storm. He was trapped in her power, in her world, and no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't escape it. His mind raced. Was there anything left that could save him? Was there anything he could do to break free from her control? As Alara's grip tightened, Mark felt a strange surge of energy, an unfamiliar strength, rising from within him, as though something deep inside him had been awakened. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, vibrating with a force he couldn't explain. And then, for a moment, the grip loosened. Alara's eyes widened in surprise. Mark felt the energy inside him growing stronger, more powerful, as though the very earth beneath his feet was responding to him. It was as if he was tapping into something he had never known he possessed, a hidden strength that had always been there, waiting for this moment. He twisted in Alara's grasp, pulling away, his body surging with newfound power. No, he shouted, his voice steady and commanding. I will not be your pawn. I won't let you control me anymore. Alara stepped back, her face a mixture of shock and fury. You think you can fight me? You think you can break this bond? But Mark wasn't listening. He felt the power building inside him, pushing back against the force that had held him captive. He couldn't explain it, but he didn't need to. He knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Alara win. The unthinkable choice. The darkness around Mark was no longer suffocating. It was his to command. With every breath, he felt his newfound powers surging within him, a force that pushed back against the unrelenting pull of Alara's influence. He had been weak once, trapped by her grip, but now something inside him was awake. Something ancient, something fierce. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Alara's, and for the first time, he saw the true depth of her power reflected in her gaze. She wasn't just an alien. She was something far older, far more dangerous than anything Mark had ever imagined. But now, with the strength coursing through him, he felt something shift, a sense of clarity, like the storm inside his mind had finally quieted. "You don't control me anymore, Alara," Mark said, his voice steady, filled with the power he had tapped into. "I choose my fate now." Alara's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smile, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had been defeated. It was the smile of someone who believed they were invincible. "You think you have a choice, Mark?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You are mine. You always have been." Mark shook his head. "No, I'm not your prisoner. I'm not a tool for you to use. I'm more than that." Alara took a step closer, her presence overwhelming. But this time Mark didn't flinch. He stood firm, his resolve growing stronger with every passing second. "You don't get it," Alara said, her voice low, almost a growl. "I gave you everything. I showed you the truth. My kind, our eternal. We feed off what we desire. And you were the one I needed to complete me, the one I could take with me. But now that you're resisting me, you're only making this harder for yourself." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. His hands clenched into fists, his whole body radiating with the power he had unlocked within himself. He wasn't sure how he had found this strength, but he knew it was his now, and he wasn't going to let Alara take it away. "I won't be your prey," Mark said firmly. "I won't be part of your dark plans." Alara's expression twisted in anger. "You think you can stand against me? You're nothing but a human. You're weak." Mark's breath quickened as Alara stepped toward him. But this time, he didn't retreat. The dark energy surrounding them flared as if testing the strength of their wills. He could feel it, the raw, chaotic force that Alara controlled. But it was no longer enough to hold him down. "I may be human," Mark said, his voice rising, "but my humanity is what makes me stronger than you. You've underestimated me." With a sudden, intense movement, Mark raised his hand, focusing the power inside him. The air around him crackled with energy as he released it, sending a wave of force toward Alara. She staggered back, her eyes wide with shock. The energy from Mark's attack pulsed, pushing against the dark force that had once held him captive. "You don't control me anymore," Mark repeated, his voice loud and commanding. Alara growled, her face contorted in fury, but as the energy settled, she seemed to regain her composure. She wiped the blood from her lips, her eyes still filled with a haunting darkness. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice full of disdain. "You don't understand the consequences of what you've just done. You've torn apart everything I've worked for. I'll make you regret this." But Mark stood tall, unshaken by her threats. "I won't regret it. I won't let you hurt anyone else. Not anymore." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with tension. Mark could feel the power inside him, the raw force that he had claimed for himself, and he knew that this was the moment where everything would change. "I could destroy you," Alara said softly, her voice dangerously calm. "I could take everything from you in an instant, but instead, I'll offer you a choice. Surrender to me now, and I'll spare you. I'll give you power, more than you can imagine." Mark didn't hesitate. "I don't need your power. I already have everything I need." And with that, he focused every ounce of strength he had into one final surge of energy. It was a force so pure, so unrelenting, that it overwhelmed Alara's dark power. Her eyes widened in shock as the energy surrounded her, pushing her backward, forcing her to the ground. "No!" Alara screamed, but it was too late. The power Mark had unleashed was more than she could fight. It tore through the air, unraveling the bonds that had held him in her grasp, and with one final pulse of light, everything went silent. The darkness that had once surrounded them began to fade. Alara's figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving nothing but the echoes of her last scream. Mark stood alone, his chest heaving, his body still radiating with the energy he had used to break free. The world around him slowly began to return to normal. The sky clearing, the ground beneath his feet solid again. The overwhelming presence of Alara, the sense of danger and control, was gone. Mark looked around, his heart still racing, unsure of what had just happened. He had done it. He had won. But the cost of that victory weighed heavily on his mind. He had faced an enemy unlike any he had ever imagined, and in the end, it was his humanity. The very thing Alara had tried to break, that had saved him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold now, but one thing was clear. He had taken control of his own destiny, and no one, not even Alara, could take that away from him. As Mark walked away from the remnants of their battle, he looked up at the sky, the weight of the choice he had made settling into his heart. He had fought for his life, for his freedom, and now he would live it on his own terms. The war was over, but the journey, his journey, was only just beginning.